You've seen the Rwanda policy, was approved a year ago, and we've not managed to implement it yet because it's bogged down in British courts and then European courts and all sorts. It begs the question, who's in charge, as we raised earlier in this structure, So it's incredibly frustrating from our point of view as well. But we've got to press on. And at the very least, Home Secretary, Prime Minister have got to be absolutely clear that they are doing everything in their power. And if it's other people stopping it, then we need to be clear about that as well.
Hello and welcome to Reasons UK with me, Darren Grimes. I thank you very much for your company. If you do enjoy today's content, please do consider hitting that little notification bell and the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now folks, it's been a week of a budget with announcements on childcare, corporation tax, nuclear energy, full expensing and so on and so forth. So I wanted to chew the fat on this and more with a bloke that really gets what's going out in the real world. He was the first brick out of the Red Wall when he took Mansfield, and he's gone on to become leader of the council too, and he's done great work in his local patch. So what does he make of the budget and a whole host of other issues that have come about this week between Rishi Sunak and actually comparing him to Enoch Powell? I kid you not, folks, but more on that in a minute. Let's get him on now. Here's Ben Bradley MP. Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, how are you?
Now, Ben, I know that you're a massive TikTok user, right? So are you a bit worried that actually you're going to get your platform taken away from you? Because you're probably one of the most active users on the platform in Parliament. Are you concerned by this Cabinet Office security review, which has actually led to the app being banned on government devices to purportedly protect sensitive government information on smartphones?
Not particularly sensitive government information on my phone, I have to say. If the Chinese government want to scroll through pictures of my kids on a holiday or whatever, then they can, but probably not much use to them. So it doesn't worry me overly. I think it makes sense for them from a national security point of view. If ministers have got important government material, then better safe than sorry, right? Absolutely. But as far as I can see, they're not telling members of the public to come off it. And from my point of view, I try and use as many platforms as I can. I'll never be able to match Luke Evans MP's chiseled jawline on there, but I try my best. And no, I don't plan to come off it.
Would you advocate other people coming off it then? Or do you think, is this a turning point? Because obviously our relationship with China is not going to get any easier anytime soon by the looks of things.
No, it's tricky. And, most of us know, though, I think that when we put our profiles on social media, on whatever platform, you're opening up all your information to whoever, quite frankly. Everybody can see everybody's Facebook profiles and pictures and history, and people can access that if they really want to. So, look, I'd urge people to be careful about their security kind of options and put things in the right hidden modes and all the rest of it across social media. But I don't think people will be coming off it anytime soon. I think things have gone too far down that road to turn it right down now, haven't they? And from my point of view, if someone come and tell me to come off it for security reasons, of course I will, but that's not the stage they're at yet.
Now, what do you make of Sir Keir Starmer this week at PMQs going big on the Gary Lineker idiocy, which, as you know, Ben, saw him compare the government's migrant policy and the language around it to that of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. Do you reckon this is a clever way of Sir Keir getting more attention on him, or, quite typical of the sort of political opportunism from a party which, let's be honest, hasn't always had this newfound love, Ben, for freedom of expression?
It was funny. I tell you what, really sad in many ways. The comment I made, I sat next to a colleague in the chamber at the time and just said, with all the things going on in the world, honestly, this is the thing he wants to raise with the Prime Minister in his one weekly opportunity. Absolutely mad. And the irony of the Labour Party accusing Conservative benches of cancel culture is quite incredible. I've tried to avoid outrage on it all and be a bit more pragmatic, I suppose. And frankly, Gary Lineker is entitled to his view. Conservative MPs are entitled to their view of Gary Lineker's view. That's how it all works. But I just feel that if you agree and you sign up to a contract to work for a state-funded national broadcaster that is meant to be impartial, you know what that means when you sign up for it. And even if he'd have said something more measured, I don't like this policy and I don't think it will work, then I'm sure we'd have been fine with that. But that comparison with Nazi rhetoric is just unbelievable, and it raised the question for me. If you can't be impartial and you can't meet those standards, then shouldn't be state funded, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's something quite hypocritical in what Sir Keir Starmer said as well, because he gave this line about the national broadcaster dancing to the government's tune. Now, Ben, I don't know about you, but over the entire time that I've been involved in politics, I have seen precious little evidence of the BBC dancing to the Conservative Party's tune. I think that's a pretty daft thing to say, frankly. But is this a plan by Sir Keir to just get a bit more airtime on the BBC and spook the BBC maybe into thinking that, it's got to make up for its perceived bias by, in its intervention with Gary Lineker, by maybe getting Sir Keir Starmer on a bit more and trying to, navigate around the controversies now that lie with the links between the Conservative Party and the Director General and the chairman of the BBC itself? I mean, it strikes me as total nonsense and BS, and, many viewers will know what I mean by that. But the idea that the BBC doesn't swing to the metro liberal left, I think, is an absolutely absurd proposition.
Yeah, well, I've always held the view that regardless of presenters or whatever, if you're based in London and you recruit from a certain demographic of graduates in a metropolitan city, then inevitably the view within an organisation will be skewed in that direction, wouldn't it? That's just an inevitability. And for all the diversity conversations they have, my argument has always been that the massive lack is, of working class kids from the north of England. There's not many of them work in for Millbank. So there's some work for them to do. Maybe Starmer's trying to lean into that accusation of bias, I guess, and just say, you need to lean back in my direction if that's the accusation. But the whole thing really, to me, just reeks of political opportunism, as you said. He obviously thinks there's a target audience there of people that, support the BBC and will support him in those comments. But as I say, there's this accusation that somehow it's the Conservative Party that like to veto other people's opinions. Just made me howl, to be honest, in the chamber. The irony seems to be lost on him.
Well, I mean, on Saturday, it would have been Sunday when we found out the viewing figures, but I was absolutely delighted when, 500,000 extra viewers tuned in just to watch the football, Ben, as opposed to watching Gary and his mates witter on for, an hour or so. It actually struck me that was a resolute two fingers up to Mr. Lineker, and this idea that he is more important, and strikes me that's seems to be the narrative that was going on around that time, more important than the BBC and its output. I mean, the BBC, Ben's been going for 100 years. I haven't been the largest advocate. I happen to think that the licence fee funding model is regressive and antiquated, but I was actually with the BBC on this, to be honest with you, because if the BBC doesn't look to be impartial and, not taking sides on either side of the political fence, as it were, then the whole thing just falls apart, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you on that. The reasons that it is taxpayer funded, firstly that was necessary. That funding was necessary to allow people to access news and information, in the 40s and 50s that wasn't readily available. That reason isn't there anymore. We've all got all of those platforms at our fingertips all the time. The other reason is being held to that higher standard, right? That impartiality and that quality. And if they're not going to meet that and stick to the rules on that, then I totally agree with you. It shouldn't be funded in the way that it's funded. So right there with you. I think, Match of the Day was rubbish, wasn't it, in fairness? But the reason for me is it's the commentary, right? I skip through, I fast forward through the Lineker bits. Not because I particularly dislike the way he does his job, although I disagree with him, but just because I can't be asked to stay up that late. I tend to watch it on it needs the commentary over it to make it work.
Absolutely. I mean, this idea that we all need, Jugs and his mates, some glorified crisp salesman to tell us about everything that's going on in a match when I just want to see the highlights of Newcastle United. But anyway, I digress. What did you make of Labour saying that actually it would actually reimpose, because there's this whole debate about in the budget yesterday about Jeremy Hunt saying, right, we're going to scrap the limit on the lifetime pension allowance, because I doubt there are many of your constituents, Ben, who are saying to you, writing in saying actually the lifetime pension allowance limit is a real problem for me. I mean, maybe it is in the NHS, I don't know, you can tell me that, but the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeton, Labour Party, has actually called for it. He said last year, Ben, it should be scrapped to get more doctors back into the NHS. And now he's saying that Labour would bring it back. And it strikes me that they don't know, and I'm going to swear here, they don't know their arse from their elbow, frankly. It's a party without a plan, and it looks proper amateur hour. And you think to yourself, my God, you people are raising, what, 50% in some polls at the minute? Pretty shaky stuff for the Conservative Party. They could get into power. What's the plan? What are you going to do? And I don't think we've got an answer on that yet.
Well, a bit scary, yeah, as you say. But you're from Newcastle. There's no way that arse is swearing in Newcastle.
No, that's true. It is to people from the south.
No, so I mean, on the policy, I think it's the right thing. Actually, although it's not something I get thousands of emails from regular constituents about, as you might imagine. Every time I've ever been to see a GP, they've all raised this. And they've all said that we're losing people left, right and centre. I think the BMA have said today that in their survey last year, 40% of our existing GPs had said they were planning to retire in the next 12 months. And that will be a huge, huge problem.
Absolutely.
So if this helps to mitigate that, we're putting loads and loads of junior doctors and training people in at one end, but they're all leaving at the other end. So we need to try and stem that tide. So it will be helpful. And to be honest, I think if the one policy, the one Labour kind of outcome from all of that, the thing they're criticising the most is a policy that they themselves called for last September, then we were talking about political opportunism before. There it is, just opposition for opposition's sake, isn't it? But you're right, we've got to have a plan. And if you look at the polling, some interesting red wall polling I've seen this week that says Rishi's gone up a bit in popularity, but there's a lot of none of the above, right? For all the reasons you've described. If we do the things we said we're going to do, tackle some of this health service backlog, which is partly what this policy is about, but also stop the boats and some of the other major promises we've made, economic promises, then I don't think we're in a bad place, because people haven't flocked back to Labour. They're just a bit fed up with the state of the world, I think, at the minute.
Absolutely. We'll get on to a bit more of that in a minute. But I mean, I'm wondering, Ben, I've known you probably, I can't remember what year I would have met you, but probably soon after 2017, I imagine, when I worked in Westminster. And I know that you are someone who is more perhaps on the, Thatcherite, maybe tax cutting wing of the Conservative Party. You believe in actually ensuring that people can get on without a massive state, telling them, no, sir, you can't do that, and all the rest of it, in a way in which we can actually boost human flourishing and freedom. I'm all for it. But you look, though, at the latest budget, and actually it's saying, well, to pay for all of this, what we're going to do is increase the tax burden, or keep the tax burden at 37.3% of gross domestic product. Now, 37.3%, just for my viewers, that's actually the highest since World War II, when obviously we'd been totally bombed to bits. There'd been massive loss of life, and our country was in tatters. I mean, are you comfortable with that being the Conservative Party's legacy?
No. I think if you accept that the current systems and structures are what they are, then yesterday was about as good as the Chancellor could do in that sense. There's some good stuff in there around private sector growth, around encouraging business to invest and to be more productive, and all that kind of stuff is really good. There's a good example, though, of childcare policy. So that's really important, helping people access childcare so that we can go to work, so we can be more productive, so we can grow the economy. I would love for us just to tax people less so they could afford to pay for childcare. That would be my answer. But what he's done is a step forward that will help people. So swings roundabouts, I suppose. But in that big picture, I just feel that over time, you can't accept that the structures and the processes are right and good. You've got to plan for that. You've got to lay that out. And bring people with you, because we saw the example of Liz Truss in the autumn, that if you just all of a sudden announce you're going to change it all, you see what happens. The system says no. But I do fear that we live in a country where actually your elected leaders aren't really in charge of a lot of things, and you've got systems and a great big bureaucracy that really limits what you can do, and that's a massive problem that at some point we're going to have to take on if we're not just going to drift into ever higher taxes and bigger state.
Yeah, managed decline, really. I mean, Ben, if I'd told you in 2017 that Liz Truss would be the future leader of the Conservative Party, I imagine you would have told me to go sling me hook.
I might have done, or I might have done some proper swearing. It was difficult, and problem is I agree with a lot of what Liz wanted to do, and I think
Absolutely.
a lot of my colleagues did. Problem is she managed it really badly, and that's the thing. Right? If you're going to change a system, you almost need like a revolutionary conservatism, if that was ever a thing, that almost does take the system to task, right? The thing that Mrs. Thatcher managed to do, the thing that Boris managed to do in many ways, was to almost oppose the system that they were, whilst they were in government, and to talk about making those major structural changes. That's not easy. But it's something we're going to have to do, because at the minute, inevitably, put bureaucrats in charge of things. They advocate for more bureaucracy and more work for themselves and ever bigger institutions, don't they?
Absolutely. And I mean, a lot of the economic woes that we're going through at the minute, sky high inflation and, well, comparatively to what we've experienced, certainly in my lifetime, probably not since Black Wednesday, since everything went kaput because of the exchange rate mechanism, that we've experienced interest rates and things going up, causing headaches for people across the piece. But Ben, I just constantly say to people, this isn't down to some Tory mismanagement. It's entirely down, in my view, to the disproportionate nature of the lockdown strategy and the length of them and the severity of them, and that actually the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, you name it, they were all saying actually we need lockdowns to be harder, we need them to be faster, and we need them to be more draconian. And these are the things that have exacerbated our current travails. I mean, after all the lockdown files came out, have you sort of changed your view on the way in which we handled things, or do you think actually it was all proportionate and Matt Hancock's hunky-dory?
I've never felt that Matt Hancock was hunky-dory. But I mean, I was one of those at the time who opposed the later lockdowns, voted against them, and I very much felt that the long-term economic and social impact was going to be harder and worse than the benefits of from a short-term health perspective. So that's an argument I've been making for a long time. I think the evidence shows, and the Matt Hancock stuff shows, that there were some decisions in there that were more political than based on science, and that's upsetting to hear, because you're right around the long-term impact economically, whether it's business or growth or employment, or now we've got 2 million people off on long-term sick post-COVID. That's now doubled. It's had a huge impact, and not one we're going to be able to recover easily, which, why I say in some ways that, in terms of the budget, the Chancellor's got a pretty difficult hand he's trying to tackle, and that stability in the short term is no bad thing. But I would like to see, particularly as we do manifestos and in the build-up to the election, something a bit more, small state radical.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think of this misconception then, or this idea that your constituents and constituents throughout the Red Wall, they actually basically want Britain to continue on this trajectory of basically being a social democrat state where, the government, the state does more and more and people do less and taxes are higher as a consequence? I mean, does that ring true for you? Do you think your constituents are calling out for, the big hand of government to come along and help them, or would people, rather get on with things and be able to manage their money themselves? I mean, what's your view on that conversation?
I don't buy that at all. I think that constituents in many places like Mansfield and around most of the country actually are the biggest advocates for personal responsibility and freedom and independence in that sense. I get far more people contact me and say, even if the back of the budget, the childcare policy is an example, why am I paying for everybody else's childcare? And it's a fair point to make. That will help a lot of people. But my answer would be, cut taxes, give people the money, give them the choice and the freedom to do it themselves. And even when you're never going to make handouts big enough, are you? You're never going to be able to give away enough money to make people content that they have now got enough actually from the state. The more you give, the more people expect. And we've seen that particularly post-COVID, the amount of government intervention has gone through the roof. And I always find that a huge proportion of my constituents actually would like to be left alone. I've always argued that, if I can afford to pay my way, if I can afford a reasonable lifestyle and a holiday once a year, actually, I'd rather the government just butted out and left me to it. And that's very much the view I get from most people in Mansfield.
Where are you at then? Because you sort of touched on it earlier. You mentioned childcare and the intervention that the government have made there. Now, some people are saying, "Wow, this is great. I've been calling out for this for quite some time," and others, some of them your colleagues, have actually been raising the alarm on this. One of your colleagues, Miriam Cates, has actually said that, and she's basically argued, if you compare the rates of people actually having children in Britain today, in 1941, fewer than 20% of women actually reached their 30th birthday without having given birth to at least one child. Now, Ben, it's over 50%. Now, you're a dad yourself. Why is it that you think so few people are actually choosing to have kids today? Because this is quite a serious problem. We've got a sort of demographic time bomb, a ticking time bomb going off here, where large swathes of people are going to need a hell of a lot of social care in the future, because we're living longer. It's not a bad thing that we're living longer. I'm certainly not saying that at all. But we're going to need people to look after more people who are living longer. But if we're having fewer kids, that's going to be a real problem, isn't it?
I think it's a really important point. We are already experiencing it, right? And it's part of this question about the role of the state in it all. Not only do we have fewer kids, we live longer, we've got more complex conditions. But we also don't do community in the way that we used to do it. We used to talk about, the village. It takes a village to raise a child. We would expect people to look after their elderly parents. We would expect much more of a family network around people. And that was just a given, right? Somebody would do that. And now the expectation is that the state will provide that, and increasingly provide that for free. I just think, and it goes back to the point about the structures and to the point about the expectations of the state. At some point, we're going to have a really serious conversation about what is feasible and realistic from our health service, from our social care service, to say, these are the things we should expect to get for free, in that sense, taxpayer funded, within the system. And actually, these are the things that we're going to have to think about differently and fund differently, because you can't just spend more and more and more and tax more and more and more and grow the level of service and expectation forever. It's not feasible. I'm not sure we're brave enough to have that conversation yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, and I actually think we should be looking at the tax code to encourage people to bring up kids. I mean, people would, it strikes me that the evidence suggests that people would rather look after their children themselves, right? A lot of parents actually don't want to go back to work instead of raising their own kids. I realise a lot of people don't have a choice, but shouldn't we be doing all we can to actually encourage family life, especially given the massive rates of family breakdown that we experience in Britain? I mean, Ben, we've got the highest levels, and I think a lot of people won't know this, but we've actually got the highest rate of family breakdown in the whole of the OECD.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a huge challenge for all sorts of reasons. That, housing is a really good example. Population is growing, but actually increasingly families need two family homes because parents have separated and you're using twice as much resource as you would have been if you were together. And I think even the most frustrating thing perhaps is that even the Conservative Party is shy about making the case for family and family values these days, in the wake of all the kind of equality and diversity agenda. We don't like to talk about, a mum and a dad and kids anymore, which is infuriating in many ways, because it's still the majority of people, the majority of families around the country. And we need those social networks, we need those community networks to look after each other and to keep an eye out for each other. That would relieve a massive burden on public services. So we do need to make a case for it more. We do need to be clear about it. And there are all sorts of things in tax, as you say, but also in like flexibility around work. So if you could build a more staff-friendly or flexible way of working and systems of working that would allow more parents, single parents, mums typically, to work within school hours or to work more flexibly in different professions. You could get more people into work in a way that's manageable and doesn't impact on family in the same way. So loads of opportunities.
Yeah, it's an interesting point as well. And I know that you've been quite vocal in the past on this idea of, well, the one group in society that we don't really focus on is white working class kids, for example. But it strikes me that fatherless homes actually they go across divides in the country. Well, divides for want of a better way of putting it, Ben, where actually fatherless homes affect black kids just as much as they affect white kids, where you've got real problems with actually proof of it showing that it perpetuates a cycle basically of despair and people not getting on in life if homes are without a father. And I don't think we're really talking about that sort of thing. We're just not really willing to engage with that debate.
Nobody wants to talk about genuine poverty and socioeconomic circumstances like that. Nobody wants to talk about blokes as a good thing either. And again, it's infuriating. It's something I try and raise in Parliament all the time. We've had debates recently about male role models, for example, in schools. I feel very strongly that if you haven't got a decent male role model at home, whether that's dad who's not there or dad who's just a really bad role model, you need that in other settings, right? You need youth work, you need schools. We've got no male primary school teachers, basically, anywhere in the country. So there's things we can do in a social setting. But actually, as you said, a real focus on supporting families to make them work, to help them work. I'm a council leader, and we're trying to embed this work in the most disadvantaged communities. It says, right, how do we get into your family early when you're starting to experience problems and help you to tackle it together, so that the state doesn't then have to pick up the pieces when you've got to take kids into care and stuff later on. How do we do that low level stuff to help people get on and do things together? It's a massive shift because increasingly we are risk averse, and we historically have just stepped in and taken kids off, and families split up and break up, and we've had to deal with it.
Absolutely. I wish there was more of a focus on these sort of issues instead of, perpetuating that. When it comes to children these days, all we seem to talk about are ideas like white privilege or gender identity or a whole host of issues, which I think are totally missing what's really important to focus on, which are these sorts of issues that you mentioned, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're focusing on the wrong stuff, aren't we? It's almost like we've kind of evolved to a point where there are so many people in our society, particularly, well-off kind of champagne socialist kind of stereotypes, right, where you've got no real issues in your life. You're not scratching around to put food on the table. You're not having to deal with any of those fundamentals. So you're off with the fairies, focusing on all sorts of things because you've got the time and the capacity to do it, right? I did A-level psychology. We learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where you've got to tick the basic boxes, and only when you've ticked the box for food and shelter can you move on to the next stuff. And everybody's got their boxes ticked now, or a huge swathe of our society has. And they're focusing on all that stuff, right? We're bang on about the environment, we're bang on about people's gender identity, because they've got no real problems, frankly. Yeah. But that means that those people who have got those genuine needs don't get the focus and the support and the funding and the priority, because we're all busy arguing about what pronouns people have got.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the boats there as well. I know it's an issue that's coming up thick and fast in most constituencies, but primarily, especially, it's a big issue for Conservative Party voters, all 14 million of them back in 2019. Now, Ben, do you think it's sensible? Have you thought about the fact that, we're given the French, we've already, I think, over the last decade, given something like £300 million, if you take it all together. Now we're given another 500 million, that's £500 million in going to the French to actually deal with the small boats issue. It strikes me that in a country that rejects far more asylum applications than we actually do here in Britain, they're not going to suddenly turn around and say, oh, well, you know what, we've got this cash, we're going to do something about it. And I think it's ultimately going to lead to a hiding and nothing here that's going to leave your constituents and others likely feeling that they're even more helpless and powerless to actually stop the incursion that's going on at our southern border.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and we're in a really difficult place where inevitably you're going to have some kind of partnership in order to tackle it, because part of it has to come that side of the border. Everybody's frustrated at the amount that that's cost, and it's clearly been ineffective. I think it's the first time we've had UK border force based over there, though, and hopefully that makes a difference rather than relying on the French to deliver it all. And the bill that's going through Parliament, for all the drama about it, I think is absolutely the right thing. You know, my constituents fully expect us to have shot these numbers of people dramatically over the course of this year. I don't know whether that's feasible in the system and the structures that we've got, because you've seen the Rwanda policy, was approved a year ago, and we've not managed to implement it yet because it's bogged down in British courts and then European courts and all sorts. It begs the question, who's in charge, as we raised earlier in this structure, so it's incredibly frustrating from our point of view as well. But we've got to press on, and at the very least, Home Secretary, Prime Minister have got to be absolutely clear that they are doing everything in their power. And if it's other people stopping it, then we need to be clear about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, on that then, I don't know if you saw this, but the New European mocked up an Alistair Campbell's favourite paper. He writes for them quite often. You've got Paul Mason as well, former commentator, now seeking to actually get in and stand for the Labour Party, Ben, God help us all. But anyway, this image here shows Enoch Powell, the former Conservative MP back in the day, who gave that River of Blood speech, actually stood behind the podium of Stopping the Boats that Rishi Sunak stood in front of last week. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that we're actually dealing with here, that we're actually having to contend with, which is people suggesting, like Gary Lineker, that, it harks back to 1930s Germany, or a whole host of other totally insane, in my view, things to be said. And you consider, Ben, this is a country that took 500,000 refugees in last year. I mean, the idea that that is tantamount to Nazism isn't just offensive, but frankly, it's bloody stupid.
Yeah, it's nuts, isn't it? And the language is incredible, particularly when I saw a really interesting thread on Twitter today about Labour's policies around asylum and migration in the early 2000s, where a lot of the stuff we're doing is stuff that they suggested or implemented at the time. So the fact that they can come out and call it all the ridiculous language that they have in recent days is just nuts. But I've always argued that none of this, we heard it in the chamber in the immigration bill on Monday, this is about racism, it's about xenophobia, all that kind of stuff, could not be further from the truth. It's incredible how welcoming we have been as a country to Afghan interpreters, to families from Hong Kong, to Ukrainian families, hundreds of thousands of them, as you've said. It's not about race, it's not about foreign people, it's about fairness. And actually, even within our asylum system, we should be helping and supporting the people who are following the rules, fleeing genuine peril, genuine danger and in fear, not people who are in France and are perfectly safe and who are trying to subvert the system.
Yeah, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm sorry, but, if you're in France, Ben, you're not escaping bombs and bullets, you're escaping cheeses and baguettes, right? Ultimately, that rings true with me. You're not in an unsafe country. But then just finally, Ben, I don't want to keep you for too long, but the polling, and you sort of touched on that polling earlier, that showed that, Rishi Sunak is bringing people back in as far as tackling migration's concerned. I get that, and his personal polling has seen an increase, which tends to suggest that there may come a marked increase in the poll share across the piece for the Conservative Party. But currently, it shows that the Tories are going to stand to lose the red wall. I mean, what the hell's gone wrong, right? Because back in 2019, you and I and others were like the cat that got the cream, right? It suddenly seems like the tide has turned and the Tories look to have well and truly cocked this up. Am I being too harsh?
Well, I think there's certainly, since then we've obviously had COVID, which has been a massive challenge, and for all the things that I believe in, and I think you believe in, Darren, about the state, it's been the most interventionist and expensive period that any of us can really recollect. And part of that, because of the nature of COVID, was inevitable. But rowing back from that is really, really difficult. And it's not what people want. Economically, it's been really difficult. So I recognise the challenges, but we've got to be bold now, right? And we've got to lay out all the things that we believe in that sense, and deliver on promises. I keep saying, looking at that same polling, right? People aren't flooding back to the Labour Party. Nobody has just all of a sudden decided that Labour speak for me now. The biggest reason I've seen in the figures that people don't want to vote Labour is actually their immigration policy in my part of the world. So, we're on the right side of the argument, but we've got to prove to people that we're actually going to be able to deliver outcomes. Otherwise, they'll go elsewhere. The biggest numbers I've seen are that people feel none of the above, don't know, won't show up. Not that they're massively anti-conservative. In many ways, I think people want us to do it. They want us to do well so that they can vote for us and feel that they can vote for us, because they still certainly don't want Labour.
Yeah, I think that does ring right. It's sort of a plague on all your houses. It's the mood of the nation at the minute. I know I said just finally, but Lee Anderson, he strikes me as, he won backbencher of the year last year for from Conservative Party members. Should he, Ben, have been made chairman of the party? And do you think that should be an elected office by the members of the parliamentary party, of the membership of the Conservative Party?
It's definitely a role for Lee. I think he's embraced it. I think he's a really refreshing.
Oh, he has.
In it all. I spend a lot of my life talking about Lee, which is really frustrating. To be fair, he was a Labour councillor in Ashfield when I was the Conservative group leader, and it's partly my relationship with Lee that kind of convinced him to come across. So I take full credit and no blame for anything he might do. There's a place for Lee, and I think the more authentic voices like that can add to the debate within the party is really helpful, because actually, there's a lot of people, even within the Conservative Party, dare I say it, that might not share entirely conservative views and values. So I think it's really important that we make a case for our communities. I'm always pleased when he's there, because it means I can always come across as the measured, sensible one, whilst he does the kind of rhetoric. So, but I do think there's a real role for members in choosing who represents them for the party. I've always felt the party chairman should be a voice for the membership in the government, not a voice for the government to the members. And it's not always felt that way. So I got a lot of sympathy with that, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. I think that's what the membership needs, because ultimately, Ben, if you don't have people handing out, flyers, knocking on doors, well, that's it. You're toast, really, right? The grassroots help get you guys elected, and maybe they need a bit more of a TLC from the Conservative Party. But we'll leave it there, Ben. I thank you very much for your time, and we'll have to get you back very soon.
Nice to see you, Darren.
Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.